Another rainy day here in Florida, and it doesn't happen that often. It is, after all, the Sunshine State. But never mind that. We're going inside the shop this morning, and we're going to talk, or I'm going to give you the lesson. What are some of the biggest mistakes you're making with braided line? Let's go talk about it. All right, like I promised, today's lesson is going to be all you want to know about braided fishing line. Now, many of you will call me out on this because you see me exercise a lot of my bait casting equipment with fluorocarbon line. And that is true, but that's all situational, and that depends on spooky fish, clear water, whatnot, whatever technique I happen to be using, which is very specific. But by and large, I'm using 30-pound braid most of the time on these reels. That's what I use most of the time. So I'd say there's a pretty good balance there. But on spinning gear, 100% of the time, or I'm gonna say 99% of the time, I'm using 10-pound braid. Why 10-pound braid? I feel like most of us think that 10-pound braid is too light. It's just too light, CA. It's like, I don't want to take a chance missing out on a 40-inch snook because I'm using 10-pound braid. You don't choose the braid based on that alone. I use 10-pound braid, I'm going to tell you right now, 90% of the time, and probably at least 5 snook that I can remember in the last decade that have been over 40 inches were all caught on 10-pound braid, every one of them. And that's because 10-pound braid does not break at 10 pounds. It just doesn't. And the other thing is you'd have to have exactly 10 pounds of pressure on it. That's hard to create with a rod that has a parabolic action that gives and takes. So 10-pound braid offers you an awful lot of tensile strength. The only time that that's going to come into a negative play for you is if you're fishing around such cover that you cannot afford any drag slippage at all because they may run around barnacle encrusted concrete pilings or into a ledge or something like that where you could break them off. But other than that, I mean, most of us are fishing open zones. 10-pound braid is ideal. It gives us great casting distance. The baits have way more action with that lighter, limper braid. And in many cases, you can just put so much more line on your reel that way. And that way, if you have to take a few rod links off, it just doesn't cost you casting distance. So that brings me to this braid color, because that's another question that hits this channel a ton. Braid color. What does braid color really mean? Well, the most popular braid color I can tell you right now is moss green. It is. That's the one that every store, every retailer, whether they're online or a brick and mortar, they sell more green braid to more inshore fishermen than any other color. But there are tons of colors out there. There's fluorescent colors. There's white, there's blue. So there's a lot of variability out there, and the question I get is, does the color matter? Here's how I always choose. If I'm going to have a mid water column or surface type bait, I usually go with the white or the blue. That's what I usually go with. If I'm going to be fishing off-color water, backcountry zones where I'm skipping underneath trees, or I'm fishing a bait that stays close in the bottom and in the grass and stuff, I will oftentimes opt for the green. But much of that is just pure speculation whether the fish care or not, which in many cases, they probably don't. If you put fluorocarbon leader on, they're never gonna know, especially if you put long links, it's not gonna be that big a factor. So braid color for me is those couple of scenarios that I shared with you, and the fact that I can detect a bite better, especially if I'm using the blue or the white, or maybe even a fluorescent green. Let's just say I'm throwing a plastic shrimp. I'm throwing it in the current and I'm letting it fall down. If I see that line jump real quick or get tight, go straight down, I can reel down and hit them. I know instantly that I got a bite. I would never really know that if I were throwing the fluorocarbon as much, or if some of you are still throwing mono, which I know it's very popular in some places in the country. But that's the reason that I utilize braid color, and I still think that it's a factor in that you should have a couple of different colors in your tackle bag. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is rod actions, because that's one of the mistakes everyone makes. And that is, most of us, when we're using braided line, especially you spinning rod fanatics, is you're wanting to use rod actions sometimes that may be too heavy, too fast, too stiff for the braid that you're using, which will create wind knots. You know, that's one of the reasons wind knots happen. But the other thing is you're pulling the lure away from the game fish. You get a tap and you're so quick and it responds so fast because there's zero stretch in braid. You pull, for every 6 inches, 8 inches you pull this way, the lure moves that. So you can pull it away from fish that are nipping at a bait. Sometimes it's nicer to have that medium action with a moderate fast tip that allows them to get a hold of it. I especially believe this is true with paddle tails and with spoons, and it's what I favor most of the times. And the reason for it is they'll swim up and you can feel that lure starting to act funny all of a sudden, and then you feel that tap tap and you think they have it and you pull it away. But if you just give them a second where they really load that tip up, then you've got such a positive connection, and your hook penetration is so much better with braid. So just give them a chance to eat it. So try to think about, especially if you're using treble hook plugs and things like that, try to stay in those medium action powers with your 2500 and 3000 size reels, and not have as many medium heavies unless you're throwing a bigger hooked jig, or maybe you're throwing Texas rig or something like that, where you actually need to come through some plastic, or you know, big jigs like this, like the Redfish eye, where you have to really lay it to a fish to pull them away from something. Those are the only times you're really, with spinning gear, going to need it. And that's why I use casting gear so much. I have a lot more control that way. So we talked about bite detection, we talked about braid color, we talked about rod power. What creates those wind knots? We just talked a little bit about having too heavy a power rod for a lighter braid, which bunches line up on the cast if you don't have the balance right. But a lot of the poor line management issues comes from the fact that when you make the cast with your setup, that when this line is pulling off that spool, when this braid comes off that spool, you either need to have this finger feathering it so it straightens the line out, so you don't end up, remember, braid floats, so it'll have this big parabolic bend on the surface whichever way the current or the wind is blowing it. Or you need to cup with your left hand, vice versa if you're wrong-handed. Cup it down and drop that tip so that you keep that line straightened out. That helps a lot. It really helps a lot, just on the cast. Then closing the bail by hand. Because the braids are so limp, they have an issue with getting those wind knots. So you have to mitigate that by closing bails with your hand manually, or feathering spools on the cast. And it doesn't cost you that much casting distance. If you want that maximum casting distance, throw spools that are filled completely up, like this one, completely up. If you fill the spool completely up, you will get that maximum casting distance that you so desire. Other things that I've noticed with braid is line to leader connections. Many of us these lines are thin, okay? This is a 10-pound diamond braid. This is an 8-carrier braid. This is their Gen 3 technology that they use. It is just a nice, soft, supple, super thin line. It is the equivalent of mono of about 2-pound test. Pretty thin, it's like 0.16 millimeters, yes. So when you have lines that thin and you might be using leader weights that are 30 and 40 pounds, the best thing to do when you go to tie a uni knot or whatever knot that you happen to tie, if you don't tie FG, is to double that braid. See how you double the thickness of it? And then tie the knot that way. And then the knot is more balanced and it won't be weighted too heavy on one side or the other and have a tendency to break or catch guides because the braid side is so thin. It makes that noise going through. It'll give you a more balanced knot. And that's just me over time, watching clients, teaching them, coaching them, and letting them know what works. But those, I would say, are the most common misconceptions and mistakes that I'm seeing with you know, both friends and clients when we're using braided line. But trying to justify, you know, using 20-pound braid on spinning gear, I just don't see it. I mean, there's a few instances with big game fishing, big snook around jetties and things like that. If I'm going to nearshore rocks and patch reefs to catch fish that can get me underneath something like gag grouper or something like that, yes, I'm jumping up to 30-pound braid. But typically, the only time I'm using anything in the 30 and 40 and 50 and 60-pound weights with spinning gear, I'm tarpon fishing or grouper fishing. If I'm using this braid at any other time, it's on my casting gear because casting gear behaves completely different. I don't lose a lot of casting distance by going to 30-pound braid on a casting reel because it shoots the line off instead of having to pull the line off. There's a big difference, and we will talk about that in another line video. But if you found this being extremely helpful to you when it comes to making braided line decisions on any of your tackle, please give us that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. And we teach more of this stuff on a weekly basis in course material right there at FlatsClassUniversity.com. All right. I've got to get these reels spooled up because I'm headed to the water tomorrow to actually go film. That's all I got for you.